The sun dipped low over the bustling downtown streets, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and deepen the cracks in the sidewalk. The faint hum of the evening rush blended with the occasional car horn and the distant chatter of street vendors. In front of the old brick library, a man sat hunched over, his tattered coat barely shielding him from the biting autumn wind. His name was Isaiah, and while the city buzzed with life around him, it felt as though he had become invisible, just another figure lost in the blur of a busy world. Isaiah's dark, calloused hands cradled a styrofoam cup, jingling with a few spare coins that strangers had tossed in throughout the day. His weathered face told stories of years gone wrong. Once a proud young man, with dreams of becoming a teacher, life had chewed him up and spit him out, leaving him stranded on these unforgiving streets. His tired eyes scanned the faces passing by, hopeful for a trace of kindness, but most people avoided his gaze, stepping wide to avoid him as if his presence alone was contagious. It wasn't always like this. Isaiah remembered the warmth of a home, the laughter of his son, and the steady rhythm of a job that gave him purpose. But then came the layoff. The bills piled up, his marriage crumbled under the weight of financial strain, and the final blow, the sudden loss of his son in a senseless accident, left a hole in his soul too deep to fill. The streets became his refuge, a place to disappear when the memories grew too heavy. Tonight, the air felt sharper, carrying a tension Isaiah couldn't quite place. Across the street, a police cruiser idled at the corner, its blue and white paint gleaming under the streetlights. Inside sat Officer Brent Hargrove, a man whose badge shone as brightly as the chip on his shoulder. Brent leaned back in the driver's seat, sipping his coffee and scanning the street like a hawk circling its prey. His square jaw and piercing eyes were intimidating, but it was the smug, self-assured smirk that made people uneasy. Brent had grown up in this city, but not the part where people like Isaiah lived. His father, a decorated police chief, had taught him early on to separate the good from the bad, the deserving from the undeserving. Brent wore those lessons like armor, convinced that people like Isaiah were where they were because of their own poor choices. To him, homelessness wasn't a tragedy. It was a consequence. Isaiah noticed the cruiser but kept his head down. He'd seen that officer before, patrolling the neighborhood, scowling at anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of belonging. Isaiah tightened his grip on the cup, hoping Brent's gaze would slide past him like the others. But tonight wasn't his night. The cruiser's door slammed shut, and Brent stepped onto the sidewalk with deliberate, heavy strides. His polished boots gleamed, his belt jangling with the weight of authority. A chill ran down Isaiah's spine as Brent approached, his shadow falling over the small patch of sidewalk Isaiah had claimed as his own. "What do we have here?" Brent's voice was cold, laced with mockery. Isaiah didn't respond, keeping his head low. He'd learned long ago that silence was his safest weapon. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Brent kicked the edge of Isaiah's cup, sending coins scattering across the pavement. The metallic clink echoed louder than it should have, drawing the attention of a few onlookers who quickly turned away, unwilling to intervene. Isaiah looked up, his eyes meeting Brent's. There was no anger in his gaze, only a deep, weary resignation. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from days of exposure to the elements. Brent scoffed, crossing his arms. "You're bothering me. Loitering, panhandling. You know it's illegal, right? Or are rules just optional for you people?" The words stung, but Isaiah bit his tongue. Arguing would only make things worse. "I'll move," he muttered, reaching for the scattered coins. His fingers trembled as he tried to gather them, but before he could, Brent's boot came down hard on his hand, pinning it to the pavement. Isaiah winced but didn't cry out. Brent leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can just set up shop wherever you want? Maybe a night in a cell will teach you some respect." Across the street, a woman paused mid-stride. She'd been walking home from work, her arms heavy with groceries, when the commotion caught her attention. Her name was Cassandra, and though she was small in stature, there was a fire in her that refused to dim. She stopped behind a lamppost, her heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. Cassandra knew all too well how quickly these encounters could escalate. Her brother had been in a similar situation once, a misunderstanding with an officer that ended with bruises and a broken spirit. She couldn't just walk away. Not this time. Her phone trembled in her hand as she hit record, the screen glowing faintly in the evening light. Brent hadn't noticed her yet, too focused on asserting his dominance over the man beneath him. "You're pathetic, you know that?" he sneered, lifting his boot just enough for Isaiah to pull his hand back. Isaiah straightened as much as he could, his voice steady despite the fear simmering beneath it. "I'm just trying to survive," he said, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Brent opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, the radio on his shoulder crackled to life. "Unit 12, report your status," a voice barked. He glanced at the cruiser, then back at Isaiah, his jaw tightening. "Stay here," Brent ordered, as if Isaiah had any intention of running. The officer stomped back to his car, muttering under his breath. From her hiding spot, Cassandra's mind raced. She had the footage, proof of Brent's actions. But what now? Confronting him directly could put her in danger, but walking away felt like abandoning Isaiah to an unjust fate. Across the street, Isaiah shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to the cruiser and back to the sidewalk where Cassandra stood unseen. He didn't know it yet, but the moment that would change everything was only seconds away. In the distance, the sound of approaching footsteps broke through the tension like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Cassandra glanced over her shoulder, her breath hitching as two figures emerged from the shadows. She wasn't the only one watching. Isaiah's hand throbbed as he rubbed the deep imprint left by the officer's boot. His breathing was shallow, his body still tense from the altercation. For a brief moment he allowed his mind to drift, back to a time before the streets became his home, back when life still made sense. It was a warm Sunday afternoon. Years ago, and the scent of fried chicken and fresh cornbread filled his small kitchen. His wife, Monica, had always insisted Sundays were family days, no matter how busy their schedules got. She moved around the kitchen with ease, her laughter filling the air as she playfully scolded their son, Malik, for sneaking a bite of dessert before dinner. Isaiah had sat at the table, watching the scene unfold, feeling like the luckiest man in the world. Malik was his pride and joy, a boy with a sharp mind and a heart full of dreams. Isaiah used to help him with his math homework, though Malik rarely needed it. He was a natural, always eager to learn and quick to find solutions. "One day, you'll go to college," Isaiah had said more than once, ruffling Malik's curly hair. "You'll be the first in the family, and we'll be there cheering you on." But that was before the accident. Before a distracted driver barreled through a red light and shattered their world in an instant. Malik was only 12. Isaiah still remembered the unbearable silence in the hospital waiting room, the weight of Monica's sobs against his chest when the doctor delivered the news. Grief consumed them, pulling their once happy family apart like a threadbare quilt. In the years that followed, everything Isaiah tried to rebuild seemed to crumble in his hands. The factory where he worked shut down, leaving him jobless. The bills piled up, and the arguments with Monica grew louder and more frequent until one day she packed her bags and left. Isaiah couldn't blame her. He barely recognized himself anymore, a broken man, weighed down by failure and regret. The streets became his refuge, not because he wanted them, but because they were all he had left. It wasn't long before he learned the unspoken rules of survival. Keep your head down, stay out of trouble, and never let anyone see how much it hurts. Isaiah blinked, snapping back to the present as the police radio crackled again from across the street. Brent was still inside the cruiser, talking into his shoulder mic, but Isaiah knew better than to relax. Men like him didn't need much of an excuse to escalate. From the corner of his eye, Isaiah noticed the woman standing behind the lamppost. She was small, with almond-brown skin and a determined expression. Her phone was still pointed in his direction, the faint glow of the screen illuminating her face. He didn't know who she was, but something about her presence felt significant, like an anchor in a sea of indifference. Cassandra's heart pounded as she watched Brent through the gap between the lamppost and a nearby parked car. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the kind of weight her grandmother used to call the burden of doing. "Right. You always have a choice, Cassie," her grandmother had said once, sitting on the porch of their small Alabama home. "You can close your eyes and pretend it's not your problem, or you can step up even when it's hard." Cassandra had carried that lesson with her ever since, though it hadn't always been easy. She'd grown up watching her community struggle against systems designed to keep them down. She'd seen friends lose opportunities because of the color of their skin, watched her brother Jamal arrested for looking suspicious in his own neighborhood. It was why she chose to work as a social worker, helping others navigate the labyrinth of poverty and systemic injustice. But this was different. This was immediate, raw, and personal. As Brent stepped out of the cruiser again, Cassandra's grip on her phone tightened. He walked back toward Isaiah, his hand resting casually on the holster of his taser. "Didn't I tell you to stay put?" Brent snapped, though Isaiah hadn't moved an inch. The officer's tone was sharper now, laced with frustration. Isaiah raised his hand slightly, a gesture of compliance. "I'm not causing any trouble, officer. I'm just trying to—" "You're trying to make this corner your personal beggar's den," Brent interrupted, his voice rising. "People like you are the reason this city's going to hell." Isaiah opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, the words dying in his throat. He'd heard it all before, too many times to count. Across the street, Cassandra took a step forward, her pulse racing. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but the idea of standing idly by felt unbearable. "Excuse me, officer," a voice called out suddenly. Cassandra and Isaiah both turned to see a man approaching from the opposite direction. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and a crisp business suit that screamed authority. He carried himself with a confidence that commanded attention, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Brent. Brent straightened immediately, his expression shifting from aggression to uncertainty. Good evening, sir. Can I help you?" The man stopped a few feet away, glancing between Brent and Isaiah. "That's exactly what I was going to ask you," he said evenly. "I've been watching from my office window for the past 10 minutes, and I'm curious. What exactly are you doing here?" Isaiah frowned, unsure whether this newcomer was friend or foe. Brent, on the other hand, looked visibly uncomfortable. "Just handling a loitering issue," he replied stiffly. This individual was panhandling and causing a disturbance. "Causing a disturbance," the man repeated, raising an eyebrow. He gestured toward Isaiah, who remained seated on the ground. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were harassing him." Brent's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, sir, I don't think you understand the situation." "Oh, I understand perfectly," the man said, his tone growing sharper. "I understand that you're targeting a man who hasn't done anything wrong while ignoring the real problems in this city." For the first time, Brent seemed at a loss for words. He glanced at the cruiser as if contemplating whether to call for backup, but the man in the suit didn't wait for a response. Turning to Isaiah, he extended a hand. "Are you all right?" Isaiah hesitated before taking the man's hand, his grip weak but steady. "I'll be fine," he said quietly, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his exhaustion. The man nodded, then turned back to Brent. "I suggest you leave this man alone and focus on doing your job properly. Or do I need to escalate this?" Brent glared at him but said nothing. After a tense moment, he muttered something under his breath, stomped back to the cruiser, and drove off, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. Isaiah exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. Cassandra lowered her phone, her heart still racing as she approached cautiously. "Thank you," Isaiah said, his voice hoarse but sincere. As he walked away, Cassandra crouched beside the man in the suit, her phone still in hand. "Are you okay? Doing what's right. Take care of yourself." Isaiah shook his head, but gave her a small, grateful smile. "I'll manage," he said. Cassandra hesitated, her mind racing with questions. Who was that man? Why had he stepped in so boldly? And why did he seem so familiar? The night air felt heavier now, filled with unspoken questions and lingering unease. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, cutting through the quiet like a warning. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was only the beginning. The night had grown colder, and Isaiah pulled his tattered coat tighter around his frame. The streetlights cast a pale glow on the sidewalk, their flickering bulbs adding an eerie rhythm to the quiet. The confrontation with Officer Brent lingered like a bad aftertaste, and though the man in the suit had diffused the moment, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that the ordeal wasn't over. Isaiah shifted uncomfortably on the cold cement, his body aching from days of poor sleep. Cassandra had lingered nearby, clearly hesitant to leave him alone. She had introduced herself after Brent sped off, and though Isaiah appreciated her kindness, he couldn't help but feel wary. Experience had taught him that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. "I could get you something warm to eat," Cassandra offered softly, her gaze scanning his weathered face. "There's a diner around the corner, maybe a cup of coffee." Isaiah hesitated, his pride wrestling with his hunger. "You've done enough," he said finally, his voice low. "I'll be fine." Cassandra didn't press him, but the concern in her eyes didn't fade. "All right," she said, slipping her phone back into her pocket. "But if you need anything, I'll be around. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." He nodded, offering a faint smile. As she walked away, her footsteps fading into the night, Isaiah leaned back against the brick wall, exhaustion pulling at his eyelids. But the respite didn't last long. A shadow moved across the sidewalk, and Isaiah's heart sank as he looked up to see Brent approaching again. The officer's polished boots clacked loudly against the pavement, each step deliberate and menacing. Isaiah stiffened, his body instinctively bracing for the worst. "Back again, huh?" he said, forcing calm into his voice. Brent stopped a few feet away, his hands resting on his hips. His smirk was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. "You think you got friends now, huh?" he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "That woman, that suit, they won't always be around to save you." "I'm not looking for trouble," Isaiah replied evenly, though his hands trembled slightly. Brent stepped closer, his shadow looming over Isaiah. "Trouble has a way of finding people like you," he said, his tone low and threatening. Isaiah held his ground, though his heart pounded in his chest. He thought about Malik, about the promises he had made to be a good father, even when life didn't make it easy. Malik had always admired his father's quiet strength, and Isaiah clung to that memory now, letting it steady him. Brent leaned down, his face inches from Isaiah's. "You better watch yourself," he said. "I'll be keeping an eye on you." And just like that he was gone, disappearing into the night as quickly as he had come. Isaiah let out a shaky breath, his muscles aching from the tension. The next day, Isaiah found himself on a different corner, hoping to avoid another run-in with Brent. The sun was bright, but the wind was sharp, cutting through his thin coat. He sat quietly, his cup resting beside him, as the city moved around him. It wasn't long before a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look like you could use a real meal." Isaiah glanced up to see Cassandra standing in front of him, holding a brown paper bag. She knelt down, handing it to him with a warm smile. "It's just a sandwich and some soup," she said. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm." Isaiah took the bag, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. As he ate, Cassandra sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. "What's your story, Isaiah?" she asked after a while. He hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But something about her sincerity made him open up. He told her about Malik, about the accident, and the spiral that followed. His voice cracked as he spoke, the pain still fresh despite the years that had passed. Cassandra listened intently, her heart aching for the man beside her. "You've been through so much," she said, "but you're still here. That says something about your strength." Isaiah shook his head. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it," he admitted. "This life, it feels like a punishment. I can't escape." Cassandra placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle but firm. "You're stronger than you think," she said, "and you're not as alone as you feel." Her words lingered in Isaiah's mind long after she left. That evening, Isaiah found himself wandering toward a park he used to visit with Malik. The memories flooded back as he sat on a weathered bench, watching children play on the swings. He closed his eyes, imagining Malik's laughter echoing through the air. "Never give up, Dad," Malik's voice whispered in his memory. It was something he had said after losing a soccer game, his face flushed with determination. Isaiah held onto that memory now, letting it fuel him. But his moment of reflection was interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Brent approaching, his expression dark and unreadable. "You just don't learn, do you?" Brent said, his voice filled with frustration. Isaiah stood, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said, but Brent wasn't interested in peace. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I told you I'd be watching," he said. "You think you can just go wherever you want, like you own the place?" Isaiah's pulse quickened, but he stood his ground. "I'm not breaking any laws," he said firmly. Brent's jaw tightened. "You're breaking my patience," he snapped. The tension between them crackled like static electricity, the air thick with unspoken threats. Just as Brent reached for his baton, a voice cut through the tension. "Hey! What's going on here?" Both men turned to see the man in the suit from the night before. His presence was commanding, his eyes sharp as he assessed the situation. Brent's hand fell away from his baton, his posture stiffening. "Just handling a situation," he said defensively. The man stepped forward, his gaze locking onto Brent. "Doesn't look like that to me," he said. "Looks like harassment." Brent opened his mouth to respond, but the man raised a hand, cutting him off. "I've already reported your behavior to Internal Affairs," he said. "I'd suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Isaiah watched in stunned silence as Brent muttered something under his breath and walked away, his shoulders stiff with anger. The man turned to Isaiah, his expression softening. "Are you all right?" he asked. Isaiah nodded, though his mind was racing. "Who are you?" he asked. The man smiled faintly. "Just someone who believes in doing the right thing," he said. "Take care of yourself, Isaiah." As he walked away, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the man than he let on. The days that followed were a blur of tension and unease. Brent's hostility seemed to grow with each passing encounter, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Isaiah did his best to avoid him, but the city felt smaller with every step. Cassandra checked in on him frequently, her kindness a beacon in the darkness. She brought him food, helped him find shelter on colder nights, and even offered to connect him with resources that could help him get back on his feet. But Brent wasn't the type to let things go. His resentment simmered, fueled by Isaiah's resilience and the mysterious man's interference. Late one night, as Isaiah settled into his makeshift shelter under an overpass, he heard footsteps approaching. His heart sank as he recognized Brent's silhouette against the dim light of a nearby street lamp. "Thought you could hide from me?" Brent sneered, his voice low and menacing. Isaiah stood, his body tense. "What do you want?" he asked. Brent stepped closer, his face twisted with anger. "I want you gone," he said. "Off these streets, out of this city. People like you don't belong here." Isaiah's jaw tightened, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I have just as much right to be here as anyone else," he said firmly. Brent laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "Not for long," he said, his tone laced with a dangerous promise. As Brent walked away, Isaiah's resolve hardened. He thought about Malik, about the life he had lost and the strength he had found in his memory. He wasn't going to let Brent, or anyone else, erase him. But as the night stretched on, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. Brent's threats were escalating, and the mysterious man's involvement raised more questions than answers. Isaiah didn't know what was coming, but he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't over. The chill of the night air pressed heavily on Isaiah as he huddled beneath his thin blanket, his eyes fixed on the dim glow of distant streetlights. The echoes of Officer Brent's threats replayed in his mind, their weight heavier than the frigid wind biting at his face. He couldn't shake the feeling that Brent's vendetta was spiraling out of control, and the tension gnawed at him like an open wound. Cassandra had stopped by. Earlier, her voice filled with quiet urgency. "You need to be careful," she had warned, handing him a pair of warm gloves. "I've heard things. Brent isn't the kind of man to let this go. But I'm working on something, okay? Just hold on a little longer." Isaiah had nodded, her words giving him a flicker of hope. But as the hours dragged on, that hope began to waver. The shadows seemed darker tonight, the sounds of the city more menacing. His instincts screamed that something was coming, something he wasn't prepared for. The next day, Isaiah found himself in the heart of the city, near a bustling park filled with families and children. The scene felt almost surreal, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing inside him. He tried to focus on the warmth of the sun, the laughter of children playing nearby, but his mind remained clouded. As he sat on a weathered bench, a young boy ran past him, laughing as he chased a soccer ball. The sight triggered a wave of memories, and Isaiah closed his eyes, his heart aching with longing. Malik had loved soccer. Isaiah could almost hear his son's voice, cheering him on during their backyard games. "Keep going, Dad. You can't give up." The memory brought a bittersweet smile to Isaiah's face, but it was short-lived. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching snapped him back to reality. He turned, his stomach sinking as he saw Brent striding toward him, flanked by another officer. Brent's smirk was sharp and predatory. "Still loitering, huh?" he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby park-goers. Isaiah stood slowly, his hands at his sides. "I'm not breaking any laws," he said calmly, though his voice carried an edge of defiance. Brent's smirk widened. "That's debatable," he said. "We've had complaints about you disturbing the peace. I think it's time you moved along." Isaiah clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "You don't have the right to keep harassing me," he said, his voice steady but firm. Brent's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. He stepped closer, his posture radiating intimidation. "You're awfully bold for someone in your position," he said. "But don't worry, I'll make sure you get what's coming to you." Before Isaiah could respond, Brent grabbed his arm, his grip bruising. The other officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the growing crowd of onlookers. "Is this really necessary?" the younger officer asked, his voice uncertain. Brent shot him a withering glare. "Do your job," he snapped. Isaiah's heart raced as he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and unease. Just as Brent began to drag him away, a familiar voice rang out. "Let him go." The crowd parted to reveal the man in the suit, his expression steely and unyielding. He stepped forward, his presence commanding. Brent hesitated, his grip loosening slightly. "This doesn't concern you," he said through gritted teeth. The man raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but it does," he said. "I've already filed a formal complaint against you. Your actions are being closely monitored." Brent's face turned red with anger, but he released Isaiah's arm, shoving him back roughly. "This isn't over," he spat before storming off, the younger officer trailing behind him. Isaiah rubbed his arm, his relief tempered by the lingering tension. He turned to the man, his gratitude evident. "Thank you," he said quietly. The man nodded. "We need to talk," he said. "But not here. Meet me at the diner on 8th Street in an hour." Isaiah hesitated but nodded. As the man walked away, the crowd slowly dispersed, their whispers filling the air. Isaiah felt a mix of emotions, relief, fear, and a growing sense of determination. The diner was warm and inviting, the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. Isaiah slid into a booth near the back, his eyes scanning the room for the man in the suit. Moments later, the man appeared, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of Isaiah before sitting across from him. "I'm James," he said, offering a faint smile. "I work in legal advocacy, and I've been watching Brent for a while." James's expression
Isaiah
darkened.
took a sip of the coffee.
"Brent
His
has a
hands
history
still
of
trembling
targeting
slightly.
vulnerable people."
Why?
He said. "I've
he
been
asked.
gathering evidence to expose him, but I need your help." Isaiah frowned, his skepticism evident. "Why me?" "Because you're one of his victims," James said simply, "and because you have the strength to stand up to him." Isaiah's mind raced. The idea of confronting Brent terrified him, but he couldn't deny the truth in James's words. For too long, he had let fear and grief control his life. Maybe it was time to fight back. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally. James's smile returned, filled with quiet determination. "Just tell your story," he said. "I'll handle the rest." Over the next few days, Isaiah worked with James to document everything he had endured at Brent's hands. The process was emotionally draining, forcing Isaiah to relive moments of humiliation and fear. But with each word he spoke, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. Cassandra continued to support him, her unwavering belief in his strength giving him the courage to keep going. "You're doing the right thing," she told him one evening as they sat together in a quiet park, "and you're not alone in this." But Brent wasn't going down without a fight. His presence loomed over Isaiah's life like a storm cloud, his actions growing bolder and more reckless. One night, Isaiah returned to his makeshift shelter to find it destroyed, his few belongings scattered and broken. A note was taped to a nearby wall, scrawled in angry red ink. "Leave, or you'll regret it." Isaiah's hands shook as he read the note, his mind flashing back to Malik's voice. "Don't give up, Dad." He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He wasn't going to let Brent win. The turning point came late one night, as Isaiah and James were finalizing the report. Cassandra burst into the room, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. Isaiah and James leaned in, their eyes widening as they watched the video. It was grainy, but clear enough to show Brent shoving Isaiah in the park, his words filled with venomous hatred. The video had been posted online by a bystander, quickly gaining traction. "This is it," James said, his voice filled with determination. "This is the evidence we needed." But before they could celebrate, a loud crash echoed through the room. The front window shattered, sending shards of glass flying. Isaiah's heart raced as he looked toward the source of the commotion. A brick lay on the floor, a note tied to it. James picked it up, his expression grim as he read the words aloud. "This is your final warning." Isaiah's chest tightened, his fear threatening to overwhelm him. But as he looked around the room, at James's resolve, at Cassandra's unwavering support, he felt a spark of hope. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice steady. James nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "No," he said, "it's just beginning." The three of them stood together, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Outside, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, their wails. Cutting through the tension like a knife, Isaiah's pulse quickened as he realized the battle was far from over. But for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The night air was heavy with tension as Isaiah stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered outside the police precinct. The grainy video of Brent's actions had spread like wildfire, and with it came a storm of public outrage. Protesters held signs demanding accountability, their chants reverberating through the streets. Isaiah felt the weight of their voices, each one fueling the resolve burning in his chest. James was beside him, phone in hand, coordinating with reporters and advocacy groups who had been galvanized by the video. Cassandra hovered nearby, her presence a steady reminder of the support that had carried Isaiah through his darkest days. "You ready for this?" James asked, his tone steady but laced with urgency. Isaiah nodded, though his stomach churned. He wasn't just here to stand. In the crowd, he was here to confront Brent head-on, and this time, he wouldn't back down. Inside the precinct, Brent paced his office, his jaw clenched in frustration. The protests outside were growing louder, and he could feel the walls closing in. He had underestimated Isaiah, dismissed him as powerless. Now, with the video and mounting public pressure, Brent's carefully constructed facade was starting to crack. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he snatched it up, expecting another message from his increasingly nervous colleagues. Instead, the screen displayed an anonymous number. A calm, measured voice replied, his voice "I'm sharp. Someone who knows what you've done, Officer Brent, and I'm someone who's about to make sure the whole world knows too." Brent's blood ran cold. "You don't know anything," he snapped, though his voice wavered. The caller chuckled. "Oh, but I do, and I've sent you a little reminder. Check your inbox." Brent slammed the phone down, his hands shaking as he opened his email. His breath caught in his throat when he saw the attachments, photos, documents, and even surveillance footage, all tying him to years of corruption, abuse, and cover-ups. The final attachment was a recording of him planting evidence on a young black man during a traffic stop, his words dripping with contempt. His heart pounded as he realized the depth of the evidence against him. This wasn't just about Isaiah. This was his entire career unraveling before his eyes. Back outside, James checked his phone and smiled grimly. "It's done," he said to Isaiah. "The files are in the hands of reporters, activists, and the mayor's office. Brent's not walking away from this." Isaiah's heart raced. "What if he tries to run?" "He won't get far," James replied. "But we need to stay visible. The more eyes on this, the harder it'll be for them to sweep it under the rug." As if on cue, the precinct doors swung open, and Brent emerged, flanked by two other officers. The crowd surged forward, their chants growing louder. Brent's face was a mask of fury and desperation, but his posture remained rigid, as if clinging to some semblance of control. Isaiah stepped forward, his eyes locking with Brent's. For a moment the world seemed to still, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. "This ends now," Isaiah said, his voice clear and unwavering. Brent sneered, his bravado cracking. "You think you've won? You're nothing, a nobody." Isaiah's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "You're right," he said. "I am a nobody. But that's what makes this so powerful. You thought you could destroy me because no one would care. But look around, Brent. They care. And they see you for what you really are." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices drowning out whatever retort Brent had prepared. Reporters pushed forward, their cameras capturing every moment as Isaiah stood tall, refusing to let Brent's words pierce him. As the night wore on, more revelations came to light. James had coordinated with whistleblowers and former colleagues, of Brent's who were finally ready to speak out. One by one, they painted a damning picture of a man who had abused his power for years, his arrogance blinding him to the trail of evidence he had left behind. But the most shocking twist came from an unexpected source. A woman stepped forward during a live press conference, her voice trembling but resolute. She introduced herself as Rachel Patterson, a former investigator who had been forced out of the force years earlier after attempting to expose Brent's misconduct. "I've waited years for this moment," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. Brent ruined lives, silenced voices, and operated with impunity. But thanks to Isaiah and everyone who refused to stay silent, justice is finally catching up to him. Her words sent shockwaves through the crowd, the weight of her testimony adding even more gravity to the moment. Inside the precinct, Brent's world was falling apart. His colleagues, once loyal or complicit, were now distancing themselves. Internal Affairs had launched a full investigation, and Brent knew it was only a matter of time before he was arrested. Desperation clawed at him as he paced his office, his mind racing for a way out, but every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. His downfall was inevitable. Suddenly, the door burst open, and two officers entered, their expressions grim. "Brent," one of them said, his voice heavy with authority, "you're being placed on administrative leave, pending the investigation." Brent's face twisted in anger, but he didn't resist as they escorted him out of the building. The cameras outside captured every step, the image of his defeat spreading like wildfire. Isaiah watched from the crowd, his emotions swirling as he saw Brent led away in handcuffs. It was a moment he had dreamed of, but never truly believed would happen. Tears welled in his eyes as he felt the weight of his struggles begin to lift, her voice breaking as she said, "You did it, Isaiah. You stood up and you won." James placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression filled with pride. "This isn't just a victory for you," he said. "It's a victory for everyone Brent tried to silence." Isaiah nodded, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and determination. He knew there was still work to be done, other victims to support, systems to challenge, but for the first time in years, he felt truly hopeful. As the crowd began to disperse, Isaiah stood tall, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He wasn't just a man surviving on the streets anymore. He was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of truth and courage. And though the road ahead would be long and uncertain, he knew he wouldn't walk it alone. The days following Brent's public downfall were a whirlwind for Isaiah. The story had reached national news, sparking not just outrage, but a movement for change. People from all walks of life took to social media and the streets, demanding justice for the countless lives impacted by systemic abuse of power. For Isaiah, the wave of support was overwhelming yet humbling. Standing in front of a microphone at a community gathering organized by local activists, Isaiah adjusted his tie, a gift from Cassandra, who insisted he look the part, now that he was the face of a growing movement. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "I never thought my voice would matter," he started, his tone steady but laced with emotion. "For years I felt invisible. But what I've learned is that even when you feel unseen, your truth still matters. And when people stand together, there's nothing that can silence us." Applause erupted, and Isaiah took a step back, letting the moment wash over him. He caught sight of James and Cassandra in the crowd, their expressions beaming with pride. For the first time in years, Isaiah felt a sense of belonging, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his fight. Brent's downfall. Brent's arrest sent shockwaves through the police force and city government. Investigations revealed years of misconduct, from fabricated evidence to racially motivated arrests. His colleagues, once complicit in his schemes, turned against him in a desperate bid to save their own careers. At his trial, the courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and victims who had come to see justice served. Brent sat at the defendant's table, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a hollow stare. The prosecution presented damning evidence, emails, recordings, and testimonies that painted a clear picture of a man who had abused his authority for far too long. When the verdict was read, guilty on multiple counts of corruption, abuse of power, and misconduct, the room erupted in cheers. Brent's sentence would ensure he spent years behind bars, a fitting end for a man who had operated above the law for so long. For Isaiah, watching Brent be led away in handcuffs was a bittersweet moment. It wasn't just about one man's punishment. It was about the message it sent. The system that had failed so many was finally being held accountable, and though the fight was far from over, this victory felt monumental. A new chapter for Isaiah. With Brent's conviction, Isaiah's life began to transform. Advocacy groups reached out, offering him opportunities to speak at events, share his story, and inspire others. He became a powerful voice in the fight for justice, using his platform to highlight systemic issues and push for meaningful reforms. One evening, as Isaiah walked through the neighborhood he once called home, he noticed how different everything felt. The streets that had once been a source of fear and despair now felt alive with possibility. He stopped outside the shelter where he had spent countless nights and found himself reflecting on how far he had come. Cassandra approached, handing him a steaming cup of coffee. "Penny, for your thoughts?" she asked, her smile warm and familiar. Isaiah chuckled. "Just thinking about how strange it feels to be here, knowing I'm not the same person who used to walk these streets." Cassandra nodded. "You've come a long way, Isaiah. But don't forget that strength was always in you. You just needed the right moment to show it." Her words stayed with him as they continued walking. Isaiah knew she was right. The journey hadn't been easy, but every hardship, every moment of doubt had shaped him into the person he was today. Institutional reforms and community healing. The fallout from Brent's case sparked a series of reforms within the police department and city government. Independent oversight committees were established to investigate complaints of misconduct, inspired by Isaiah's mandatory training programs focused on racial where people could come together to share their experiences and advocate for change. One such initiative was the opening of a new community center, funded by donations from across the country. Isaiah was invited to speak at the center's grand opening. Standing on the stage, he looked out at the diverse crowd and felt a surge of hope. "This isn't just a building," he said. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we refuse to stay silent. It's proof that change is possible." The audience erupted in applause, and Isaiah couldn't help but smile. This was what he had fought for, a future where people could come together and build something better. Reflection and growth. One quiet evening, Isaiah sat alone in his small but cozy apartment, flipping through a notebook he had started keeping after Brent's arrest. It was filled with quotes, ideas, for speeches and snippets of his journey. As he turned the pages, he paused on a section where he had written down advice from his mother, words she had often said when he was a boy. "Don't let the world tell you who you are. You define yourself." He traced the words with his finger, feeling a wave of emotion. His mother had passed away years ago, but her wisdom had guided him through some of his darkest moments. She had believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself, and now he was finally living up to her legacy. Isaiah closed the notebook and looked out the window at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. A hopeful message. As the months went on, Isaiah continued to fight for justice, knowing there was still so much work to be done. But he also took time to appreciate the progress he had made, the lives he had touched, and the community that had rallied around him. During one of his speeches, he left the audience with a message that had become his guiding principle. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen alone. But when we come together, when we refuse to give up, we can create a world where everyone is seen, heard, and valued. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy a testament to the power of collective action. As Isaiah stepped away from the microphone, James and Cassandra were waiting for him, their smiles wide and their eyes shining with pride. "You killed it up there," James said, clapping him on the back. Isaiah laughed. "Thanks, but it's not about me. It's about all of us," Cassandra nodded. "And it always will be. But don't forget, Isaiah, you're the one who lit the spark." Isaiah looked at his friends, the crowd, and the city beyond. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. He had found his voice, his purpose, and his place in a world that was finally starting to change. And as he walked away from the stage, he knew this was only the beginning. Together, they would keep fighting, keep building, and keep believing in the power of hope.